Courtney is, she's amazing, incredibly organized, really talented artist, really dedicated teacher, and was a real leader in our classroom at MICA and has been in multiple communities that she finds herself in. She's an artist and teacher who makes ceramic figurative sculpture. She grew up with her family in central Pennsylvania, developing a love for creating objects from childhood. She attended Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and we're very proud to say that, where she earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, and as well as her Master of Arts in Teaching. And there's a phenomenal MAT program at MICA. After she left MICA, she also managed to somehow make this really complicated transition happen, which is getting a great teaching job, dealing with all of those responsibilities, while continuing to make a really significant body of work that she's then now propelled herself into a Master of Fine Arts program at the University of Florida in Gainesville. During that time that she was teaching, she was continuing to make and show work in the Mid-Atlantic region, while also teaching ceramics and sculpture at a really interesting program at Independent High School in Severna Park, Maryland. I'm very pleased to introduce Courtney Stone.
Shift this down a little. Thank you, David, very much for that wonderful introduction. So good afternoon and welcome. I'm so excited to have so many people here who are interested in art education. I've been thrilled to see the just interest here at this conference. I know NCECA is the Council on Education, but I think having a keynote speaker who focused on advocacy and art education and changing sort of the current paradigm of education helps to spotlight that in a really special and an important way. So I feel very privileged to be continuing this conversation and to be talking with people like you. So thank you, and I'm glad you're all here. So like David said, I'm Courtney Stone. I went to MICA, and while I was at Maryland Institute College of Art doing my teacher training, I had the opportunity to do a lot of training in Baltimore City schools. I taught at summer camps. I taught in senior centers, did some private tutoring. So I was able to experience a lot of different educational environments. And like David said, I eventually landed in an independent school where I taught for 6 years. And I was the high school 3D art teacher, but additionally, I served as grade dean for 2 of those years, which is administrative. I led diversity and inclusion initiatives at the school, and I taught workshops for educators on visual thinking, inclusion practices, and also on developing student voice in their art programs. So my teaching philosophy is student-centered, with a focus on guiding students through authentic art-making experiences. I prioritize student agency and visual literacy through creativity and critical dialogue. So it's a holistic approach that addresses the development of both the person and their artistic vision. In my own artwork, here are some recent examples. I'm curious about the nature of autobiographical memory and how it influences our relationships and our identities. So these are hollow-built figurative sculptures that use gesture, layered surfaces, and material to examine how my perceptions of past events have affected my familial relationships. So currently, I'm in my first year at the MFA program at the University of Florida. I plan to further develop my studio practice and also expand my teaching experience with college and adult learners. However, this presentation is going to focus on my experience as a K-12 art educator, and I'm going to talk about why artists should consider teaching in K-12 art and share some tips I've picked up along my way in my own experience as an artist educator to help fulfill your goals in both roles as an artist and educator. So why be an educator and an artist? Well, to answer this question for myself, I make art because that's my natural form of thinking. Last night, the guest speaker, Erica, talked about art as a form of knowing, as a form of knowledge, and that aligns perfectly with my experience. Art is my best way of interacting with the world, and so it makes sense for me to teach from that place. Now, I teach for a lot of reasons, but there's two really big ones that I think I can talk about best. So first, I teach because my own education was a transformative experience. I was lucky to have a couple very special teachers like David who opened up my world and helped me be a better person and a better artist through their teaching. And so my hope is that I can give back and do a little bit of that for others. And then the other reason I teach is students are amazing. They're in a formative place in their lives where they're open to learning and exploring, and their growth is so apparent. And young people just have a really special way of looking at the world. So kind of what my experience boils down to is this: the art making is about me, and the teaching is all about my students. Now, the prospect of teaching might be daunting or intimidating, and frankly, that's okay, it should be. How we guide our young people affects all of our futures, and it's not a task that we should really undertake lightly. But that being said, teaching is not always treated as important as it actually is. And so I think that, but teaching has the utmost influence on society. So I think that's the reason artists should really consider taking on this task. Now, you may have heard some of the buzzwords about education in the 21st century, right? And I think artistic practice and studio habits inherently instill the necessary skills for developing 21st century citizens. So our dynamic global society necessitates that its citizens are innovative problem solvers, creative thinkers, and adaptive workers. We need citizens who are able to see things from many different perspectives and develop a vision for an unknown future. As artists, we foster all of these characteristics in our studio practices. I've sat through so many professional development seminars for educators on how to teach these 21st century skills or how to teach innovation, and thought, artists have done this for years and years. So we as artists, we're the foremost experts in our field. We know best how to make art and the questions involved with making it. In a world increasingly in need of authenticity, it's us, it's we the artists who are in the best position to teach these skills to students and help them prepare for that future. So how do you do it? Teaching and maintaining a rigorous studio practice is hard work, but you all are involved in the art world, so I know that you're not afraid of a little hard work, right? And fulfilling both roles is entirely possible to do, and it's made a lot easier with some strategic choices, disciplined habits, and support. And the strategies I'm sharing today have been invaluable in my own experiences, and they're learned from primarily other seasoned educators and my own trial and error. So in my experience, teaching tended to overtake the art making as I had less support in terms of my development as an artist. A lot of teaching skills will be picked up through on-the-job experience, professional development, and training. So most of the strategies I'm going to talk about are focused on how to support your studio practice. But that's not to say that there aren't ways to direct your teaching experience to be supportive of your studio work. So I'll touch on some of those towards the end. So this is kind of my biggest piece of advice, and this has been the most influential on my own experience. Pick the school carefully. Where you work is going to have a direct effect on how much time and effort you can dedicate to your art. The climate of your school, support from administrators, additional duties, provisions for professional development, and available facilities are all important considerations that you need to make. When I started teaching, when I was in college and I started teaching, I thought public schools were kind of my only option. But then I learned about charter schools and independent schools, and Baltimore is full of all of them. And there's pros and cons to all of them. Each school is different. So even within these categories I'm going to discuss, each school is different and you need to do your research. But generally speaking, public school teachers tend to have higher salaries and can be part of a union. Generally, public schools serve a wider cross-section of the community, and public school teachers must be state certified, and their curriculums are tied to federal, state, and local standards. Budgets can often be a significant concern in these settings. And I will say public schools often have larger class sizes, and the trend seems to be less support for professional development. Now, charter schools are under the public school umbrella, but they're a different bear altogether. Charter schools can be really special places to learn about different approaches to education. However, they vary a lot in terms of salaries, teacher certification, class sizes, budgets, and stability, frankly. So charter schools do need to adhere to state academic standards, but they have a lot more freedom in designing curriculum than public schools. And then the other category is independent schools. And here they tend to have smaller class sizes and more support for professional development, although they tend to serve a smaller cross-section of the community. Independent school teachers don't necessarily need to be state certified, and their curriculum is not tied to any government standards. Budgets will vary from school to school, but generally speaking, independent school teachers are paid less compared to their public school peers and are more likely to be asked to fill additional roles within the school. So for me, independent schools were the right choice. I found administrators who valued my artistic practice, and they supported it by allowing me to use the studio facilities for my own work. And I was also able to I was also awarded some professional development grants to go to some residencies and workshops. So through the school I was at, I was able to go to Watershed one summer and Aramon another summer, which is really special and definitely pivotal in my artistic practice. I also had a good budget for the classroom, and I really valued the freedom to design my own curriculum. That was important for me. The smaller class sizes allowed me to get to know students better and give them more individual attention. And at this school, I was also able to advance my career track as an administrator, as a dean. And I was able to pursue initiatives that are important to me, like inclusion and mentoring student teachers. Now, I did not get paid much at all compared to my peers in local public schools. And we were expected to do a lot more at the school in terms of additional duties, like supervising extracurricular activities, taking on clubs, things like that. And I also felt like we were much more beholden to student resumes, athletics, parents, and donors. These compromises were worth it for me, though, because it allowed me time, facilities, and support to work on my art. And the next biggest piece of advice I would have is to be realistic about your schedule and stick to it, both in terms of your teaching and your art making. Once you have a teaching position, right, so you have to land the job, and then once you have the job, you need to structure your time, because it's really easy to be caught up in the tides of email, grading, take that last meeting, clean up that one little sink over there. But you need to protect your time, both in and out of the studio. So sign out of your email, pick up your clay tools. For me, it helped to write out my schedule, and then I told other teachers. In addition, I told my administrators too when I would be working on my studio work, and so that way they kind of knew that I was not going to respond to that email right away. And then I think this also means you need to teach smart and work smart. So in the classroom, For me, this meant having clear expectations for my students and teaching them about all aspects of art making. So I set up the studio so that the students could access the tools themselves and the supplies and clean up, and I held them to that. And it also really helped to have my students help me with labeling and setting up displays of their work. For yourself, it'll help to have a realistic plan for when you do go into the studio. I found it was easiest to work on specific tasks in cycles like, and this is going to sound really familiar to you ceramics people, making, and then cycles of glazing, and then cycles of documenting. And this helped me stay on task, and it made my own setup faster and clean up faster. So in terms of working in the studio, start by knowing how you work best and keep yourself accountable. And you can do this in a couple different ways. You can do it through your studio location, through giving yourself an accountability partner, or setting up deadlines for yourself. Think maybe about your approach to exercise, right? Like, do you work out if you have a stationary bike at home, or are you more likely to work out if you have a gym membership? Maybe you need to look into renting a studio space somewhere from a local guild or art center. Or maybe you need a buddy. Find another artist who can support your art making and keep you on target. For me, we could not afford to rent a studio space. So I worked by myself at school. But I got lucky. I found a buddy who is another art teacher at the school who's a gifted painter and illustrator. So we would share our work with each other during lunch and after school, and we would also have sketchbook hours after school where we would have a cup of tea for 1 hour and draw on our sketchbooks and talk about art. So this all really helped to keep me on task and keep me accountable. Now, I would also keep a list of specific goals, which were mostly shows or opportunities that I wanted to apply to, in a file on my desktop, because sometimes there is nothing like a deadline. Now, this one kind of has some caveats, but I'm an advocate for sharing what you do with your students. Your students are learning from you in so many ways. They learn from who you are with them and what you do as much as they learn from what you say to them. So occasionally talk about and even show them your school-appropriate artwork. Explain to them what you're doing, why you're doing that, and what your next steps are. Let them know what questions you're asking yourself and some possible solutions you might work through to find an answer. I would even talk to my older students, like 11th and 12th grade, about the process of applying to shows, packing work, and sending it out, just so they're getting a big picture of the dimensions of being an artist. Younger students are going to be amazed, and your older students are going to respect your expertise. You're showing them that art is important and it's worthwhile through your example as a working artist. Now, you may find this helpful to your own work too. I know I did. Sometimes explaining something simply for a less experienced audience provides clarity. Sometimes their questions spark new ideas, and sometimes their honesty is really surprising. But as a teacher, I found my students helped to fuel my practice and keep me accountable to my studio work. I would add that caveat that I only shared my work occasionally, and when I did, it was at a point in their project process that their work wouldn't be overly affected by seeing my work, because sharing work with students does run the risk of being overly influential on them. But I found in small doses it can be really helpful in building trust and street cred. Now, keeping an active studio practice also keeps you in touch with a lot of the questions and experiences your students are encountering themselves. Sometimes I would notice strategies in my own process and think, hey, this could really help Connor. I need to let him know what I'm doing here. On the flip side, sometimes when I would be explaining something to a student or trying to walk them through something, I would realize that I need to turn around and take my own advice. So enthusiasm is contagious. Your students are going to see your excitement, they're going to see your passion, and they're going to see your curiosity, and they're going to seek to have the same experience with their own work. A mentor teacher gave me this piece of advice, and at first I didn't think much of it, but it's proved to be really important in my experience. There are going to be so many days when you are too tired mentally, emotionally, and physically to get yourself into the studio. Let yourself be okay with that. Teaching is hard. But do something creative every day. Sometimes this means getting your hands in clay with the full steam studio session, work out your aggression kind of thing that we all love. But sometimes this means something different. Sometimes that means cook dinner, write a poem, draw in your sketchbook, take a picture and maybe put a filter on it. Do something creative. All right, you need to feed that little soul, that little creative side of you. It's still there even when you don't feel it. You need to feed it, and it's all good for you as an artist. So your work is probably going to change when you start teaching. And this is going to become true for a lot of reasons. It could be time, it could be space, it could be resources, it could be changing inspiration, source material. For me, I had to change my style of working for the first couple years of teaching until I had my feet under me as an educator. At that point, I was mentally overwhelmed and I had to spend most of my time on teaching responsibilities. And my hours in the studio were short and infrequent, and I was frustrated. I went to an art school. I wanted to be an artist, and I certainly didn't feel like I was doing that. But there was really no way that I could wrap my head around making the complex hollow-built figure sculptures that I had been making up to when I started teaching. So I decided to focus more on process and experimentation, and things got weird. I started making sculptures out of, I didn't put any pictures up. I couldn't bring myself to do that. But I started making sculptures with fabric dipped in porcelain slip, which is so different from everything I was doing. But then you're all familiar with this. The fabric burns out in the kiln, and then you have like a porcelain sculpture. And what was great about these is they were able to be built up quickly. They were intuitive. And they were also able to be left untouched for long periods of time without serious implications for the structural integrity of the sculpture. So I started to get really into this. And I decided that I would just focus on developing this vocabulary of textures and form while kind of thinking about the conceptual implications of process in my work. Now, once I got the hang of paperwork, and I streamlined my grading process, I was able to spend a lot more time and energy on my art. And I began applying to more shows, and then I was able to begin making the more complex figurative sculptures again. And that's ultimately the body of work that I used to apply to grad school. But it was important, I think, in the beginning to give myself permission to loosen up, and rather than drilling myself under unreasonable expectations that were just going to drag me down, I let myself be weird and do something different. And that helped me stay engaged in both my art making and my teaching. And so I think kind of along with that, if I can paint with a wide brush for a moment, artists, we tend to be tough on ourselves, right? We are our own worst critics. We have high expectations, and we work tirelessly after our visions. So I'm honestly not too worried about motivating you to get into the studio. But what I do want you to see is the big picture. Essentially, being an artist and an educator is maintaining two careers. And that's a marathon. That's not a sprint. It was a slow, frustrating start for me, honestly. And I was frustrated I couldn't get myself into the studio more. But recognizing the successes when they come, forgiving myself when something slipped through the cracks, and learning to say good enough, right, as hard as that is, became important parts of taking care of myself and making these sustainable career paths for me. And this one's a little bit more practical. So when you finish something, start something new before you leave the studio. It could be the base of a new piece. It could be a bag of clay that is wedged and weighed out and ready to throw on the wheel. It could be even a maquette or a really detailed sketch. But this way, the next time you do get into the studio, you already have something to jump right into. And this way, you're not wasting that headspace of getting back into the creative making mindset. You're less likely to be distracted by emails and cleaning, and you can just jump right in and maintain that forward progress. That's really important. So now I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and focus more on how you can strategize in your teaching practice to support your studio work. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of teaching will be picked up through training, professional development, and on the job. But some strategies I use to help these strategies help to make my teaching more efficient, to create more time and headspace to dedicate to my studio practice. So pretty simple, keep detailed notes. But it does require consistent and disciplined application, right? That's the hard part of this. Once you teach a lesson, jot down a couple notes about what worked and what didn't, even as the next class is pouring in. And then revisit those notes either later that day, or I'm a kind of an analog person, I guess. I keep a paper planner. And so I would jot the notes in my paper planner, and I would keep my planner so every year I could go back to that lesson and see what I wrote, what worked, what didn't, and make adjustments for the next time. So this is going to help you be a lot more efficient in planning and in execution the next time that point in your curriculum comes around again, or even just for future lessons. This is a biggie. I'm a huge fan of rubrics. Use rubrics. Grading is a humongous part of teaching, right? Because we need to give students feedback. That's how they learn, that's how they grow. I know me as an artist, feedback is important. So I spent a significant amount of time working to give my students thoughtful and meaningful feedback. I found that a well-designed rubric can clarify and unite expectations between you, your students, their parents, and administration, while also leaving room to be adaptable to student needs, because as we all know, students vary so differently from one to the next, and you need to be able to account for that. But rubrics will streamline your grading and eliminate most disputes and concerns. So this one, I was thinking a lot about this philosophy of teaching for artistic behavior, and involving the students in studio behavior helps to give them a more authentic experience of what making and creating is really all about. So I set clear routines, I clarified my expectations, and I gave the students classroom responsibilities. So like I mentioned before, they helped with setup and they helped with cleanup. I found that when the students know what to expect and what their roles are, I was able to avoid a lot of tedious discipline issues. And giving them responsibilities in setup and responsibilities in cleaning helped reduce my own prep time and helped me get into the studio faster. I think this also creates a sense of ownership in the studio and gives them, like I said, a more authentic experience. Sounds easy, right? Ask for help, but it's not always easy to do. If you have a question about best practices, consult with experienced teachers at the school and use their advice. Some of the best professional development I ever did was asking another teacher if I could come and observe them teach. Or if I was having trouble with a student, I'd ask another experienced teacher how they would handle a situation. And I would get some of the best advice that way. If you're stuck on a lesson plan, look online to see what other teachers have done for that lesson. I think the teaching community tends to be a lot like our ceramics community. We share a lot. So the resources are out there, and I've found that you rarely need to reinvent the wheel when you're teaching, and often it's better to do some research than struggle for too long. And this one, again, it's harder than it sounds, I think, as passionate people who care deeply about what we do. In the field of education, battles come in a lot of different forms. It can be easy to feel the need to do things like push art advocacy with your principal or address institutional concerns like grading policies. Also, teachers are asked to do much more than just what their contract states. You'll be asked to advise clubs, join committees, chaperone a field trip, right? None of this is really written into your contract necessarily, but you get asked, and it's easy to want to say yes. But this goes back to your schedule and being protective of your time. Sometimes you have to decide when you want to take something up and when you want to bow out so you can put that time and that energy into your artwork. Maybe your reputation as a team player takes a hit, or your ego as an art advocate will take a hit in that moment. But truly, long term, your art career is worth that. And this kind of third branch of strategy is to find a support system. As I'm sure you all know, hard work is made a lot easier with the right support. I've mentioned seeking out experienced colleagues for advice and fellow artists for accountability, but I really mean it. Be intentional about that and really do that. I learned so much from talking to other teachers, visiting their classrooms, talking, those sketchbook hours with my colleague. We'd have wonderful conversations about art making and education. I remember being nervous to share my work with her, actually, Mary Ellen, because she was I knew she was this really good illustrator, and she had been at the school for a long time, and I was just a new teacher. I was totally intimidated. But she was absolutely eager and ready for the same thing I was. She wanted somebody who she could talk about art with, and she wanted somebody who could help keep her accountable too. So she's become one of my closest friends, and her curiosity helps me see my work in different ways. And she's also really good at giving me those gentle nudges to apply to that show. So make sure you seek those people out. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention my partner. I've been lucky enough to have an understanding partner who's helped me along my journey and is encouraging of me spending time in both the studio and the classroom. And I guess kind of in this vein of being supportive, just a last little bit of advice I would say, the one thing that I wish I knew about teaching that I felt like people failed to mention when I started is that there's this thing about the learning curve. It's really steep when you start, but each year becomes significantly easier because you get to know the student names. What a small thing, right? Knowing students' names, but it makes all the difference. Knowing the school culture makes a difference, and you build this wonderful bank of techniques and lessons you can pull out of your back pocket. So trust me, it gets better. So yesterday we had a topical networking group, and I recognized some of your faces from that, so I'm glad to see you again. And the networking group was for K through 12 educators to discuss how they do just this, and to kind of crowdsource strategies for maintaining studio practices and teaching. And we had really incredible conversation about a range of topics, from how do you grade for performance to the glory of damp boxes and trying to make work last, to how to really meaningfully advocate for your program with administration. And one participant, I'm pretty sure his name is Dave. Dave, if you're here, I'm sorry if I get your name wrong. But Dave summed up the conversation really beautifully when he said that things that make your teaching thrive free you up and allow you to thrive as an artist. I thought that kind of hit the nail on the head. So I hope some of what I've shared with you today is helpful to you along your own journey as an artist and educator. And most of all, I hope you feel encouraged. I really can't say enough good about the privilege and experience I've had of being an artist and educator. and how incredible it's been to see the effects of art on my teaching and teaching on my art. This is important, and it's entirely possible. Just remember, they're both long-term endeavors, and you need to keep your sights set on the big picture. Children are our future, and your work with them through art and through education are going to make this world a better place. So thank you. And are there any questions? All right, questions? Sure. So the question was about where might you go to find online resources in terms of curriculum for ceramics, right? Did I get that right? Yes. And so for me, there were a couple places that I would go. This is going to sound hilarious. So Dick Blick has a pretty good education. Like they have some canned lessons that I would adapt pretty easily for my classroom. Actually, a little plug here, Amico, it just came out. They have some stuff online, but they're launching next week at the National Art Educators Conference. They're launching a curriculum for K through 12 art educators. And I was talking to the rep at the booth today. If you can, go talk to them tomorrow. It sounds amazing. They have like a Pottery 1 curriculum that includes like rubrics and slide lectures and yeah. So I'm kind of on the back end of that curve. But I would also, let's see, where else would I go? It's a Princeton art educators. Yep, they usually have good lessons. And then also there's a place called Teaching for Artistic Behavior, and I would find good resources there. Other questions? Sure, yeah. I wholeheartedly agree. That's part of my rubrics too. I would always have a writing component on my rubrics also, because that feedback is important and it provides good insight. And also, if you're trying to hit like standards like writing and literacy and things like that, getting the students to write about their work, you're covering a lot of bases with one exercise. Yeah. Sure. The big thing is staggering due dates. That's huge. I would, at the beginning of each semester, I would lay out the curriculum and lay out the projects. So that way, my ninth graders, 10th graders, and 11th graders wouldn't all have projects due on the same Friday, right? Because that's a nightmare. So I would do a lot of that. I would also do a lot of quick in-progress critiques. So everything that I did, I tried to make sure the students understood the expectations. So the students would get a handout of like there's different formats. Like I would do 1, 2, 3 critiques. So we would do like I'd have them write like 3 things that are going well, 2 things that are not going well, 1 question you have for me, and I would do a bunch of those like little paper exercises that they could hand in, and I could just check quickly to check progress and write a note on and help give them feedback that way. Yeah, but staggering is big. I learned that lesson the hard way my first year. Other questions?